Flavius Josephus was born Joseph ben Mattathias in Jerusalem in 37 AD. When in his early 20s he was sent to Rome to negotiate the release of several priests who were being held hostage by the Emperor Nero. On returning to Jerusalem after his mission to Rome, he found his Jewish people in revolt against the Roman Empire. Josephus was not keen on the revolt as he felt that it had no chance of success. However, he was made a commander in the rebellion, and he was eventually taken prisoner by the Roman general, Vespasian. Josephus told Vespasian that the Jewish rebellion had been prophesied by an ancient Jewish oracle, and that the same oracle had also prophesied that a world leader would emerge from this. He also told Vespasian that he was the future world leader mentioned in prophecy, and that he would be a future Roman emperor. Vespasian was rather pleased with these prophecies, and as a result spared Josephus's life. When Vespasian became emperor, he was so impressed that the prophecy that Josephus had given him had become true, that he immediately freed him, and adopted him into his family. This Joseph ben Mattathias became Flavius Josephus. For the rest of the duration of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, Josephus worked closely with the emperor's son, Titus, who was in command of the Roman army in Judea. Josephus tried to obtain the Jewish surrender of Jerusalem, which was under siege by the Romans. However, as Josephus was now considered to be a traitor by his own people, he was unsuccessful, and witnessed the fall of Jerusalem to the Roman army. After the Roman victory in Jerusalem, Josephus lived in the emperor's court in Rome, and embarked upon writing his first book, A History of the Jewish War, that he had taken part in, and witnessed the conclusion of. This was published in 78 AD. The year of the death of Flavius Josephus is unknown. Preface. 1. Those who undertake to write histories, do not, I perceive, take that trouble on one and the same account, but for many reasons, and those such as a very different one from another. For some of them apply themselves to this part of learning to show their skill and composition, and that they may therein acquire a reputation for speaking finely. Others of them err, who write histories, in order to gratify those that happen to be concerned in them, and on that account, have spared no pains, but rather gone beyond their own abilities in the performance. But others there are, who, of necessity and by force, are driven to write history, because they are concerned in the facts, and so cannot excuse themselves from committing them to writing, for the advantage of posterity. Nay, there are not a few who are induced to draw their historical facts out of darkness into light, and to produce them for the benefit of the public, on account of the great importance of the facts themselves with which they have been concerned. Now, of these several reasons for writing history, I must profess the two last were my own reasons also, for since I was myself interested in that war which we Jews had with the Romans, and knew myself its particular actions, and what conclusion it had, I was forced to give the history of it, because I saw that others perverted the truth of those actions in their writings. 2. Now I have undertaken the present work, as thinking it will appear to all the Greeks too worthy of their study, for it will contain all our antiquities, and the constitution of our government, as interpreted out of the Hebrew Scriptures. And indeed I did formerly intend, when I wrote of the war, 3. To explain who the Jews originally were, what fortunes they had been subject to, and by what legislature they had been instructed in piety, and the exercise of other virtues, what wars also they had made in remote ages, till they were unwillingly engaged in this last with the Romans, but because this work would take up a great compass, I separated it into a set treatise by itself, with a beginning of its own, and its own conclusion. But in process of time, as usually happens to such as undertake great things, I grew weary, and went on slowly, it being a large subject, and a difficult thing, to translate our history into a foreign, and to us unaccustomed language. However, some persons there were who desired to know our history, and so exhorted me to go on with it, and, above all the rest, Epaphroditus, for a man who is a lover of all kind of learning, but is principally delighted with a knowledge of history, and this on account of his having been himself concerned in great affairs, and many turns of fortune, and having shown a wonderful rigour of an excellent nature, and an immovable virtuous resolution in them all, I yielded to this man's persuasions, who always excite such as have abilities in what is useful and acceptable, to join their endeavours with his. I was also ashamed myself to permit any laziness of disposition to have a greater influence upon me than the delight of taking pains in such studies as were very useful. I thereupon stirred up myself, and went on with my work more cheerfully. Besides the foregoing motives, I had others which I greatly reflected on, and these were, that our forefathers were willing to communicate such things to others, and that some of the Greeks took considerable pains to know the affairs of our nation. 3. I found, therefore, that the second of the Ptolemies was a king who was extraordinarily diligent in what concerned learning, and the collection of books, that he was also peculiarly ambitious to procure a translation of our law, and of the constitution of our government therein contained, into the Greek tongue. Now Eleazar the high priest, one not inferior to any other of that dignity among us, did not envy the forenamed king the participation of that advantage, which otherwise he would for certain have denied him, but that he knew the custom of our nation was, to hinder nothing of what we esteemed ourselves from being communicated to others. Accordingly, I thought it became me both to imitate the generosity of our high priest, and to suppose there might even now be many lovers of learning like the king, for he did not obtain all our writings at that time, but those who were sent to Alexandria as interpreters, gave him only the books of the law, while there were a vast number of other matters in our sacred books. They, indeed, contain in them the history of 5,000 years, in which time happened many strange accidents, many chances of war, and great actions of the commanders, and mutations of the form of our government. Upon the whole, a man that will peruse this history, may principally learn from it, that all events succeed well, even to an incredible degree, and the reward of felicity is proposed by God, but then it is to those that follow his will, and do not venture to break his excellent laws, and that so far as men any way apostatize from the accurate observation of them, what was practical, before becomes impracticable. 5. And whatsoever they set about as a good thing, is converted into an incurable calamity. And now I exhort all those that peruse these books, to apply their minds to God, and to examine the mind of our legislator, whether he hath not understood his nature in a manner worthy of him, and hath not ever ascribed to him such operations as become his power, and hath not preserved his writings from those indecent fables, which others have framed, although, by the great distance of time when he lived, he might have securely forged such lies. For he lived 2,000 years ago, at which vast distance of ages the poets themselves have not been so hardy as to fix even the generations of their gods, much less the actions of their men, or their own laws. As I proceed, therefore, I shall accurately describe what is contained in our records, in the order of time that belongs to them, for I have already promised so to do throughout this undertaking, and this without adding anything to what is therein contained, or taking away anything therefrom. 4. But because almost all our constitution depends on the wisdom of Moses, our legislator, I cannot avoid saying somewhat concerning him beforehand, though I shall do it briefly, because otherwise those that read my book may wonder how it comes to pass, that my discourse, which promises an account of laws and historical facts, contains so much of philosophy. The reader is therefore to know, that Moses deemed it exceeding necessary, that he who would conduct his own life well, and give laws to others, in the first place should consider the divine nature, and, upon the contemplation of God's operations, should thereby imitate the best of all patterns, so far as it is possible for human nature to do, and to endeavor to follow after it. Neither could the legislator himself have a right mind without such a contemplation, nor would anything he should write tend to the promotion of virtue in his readers, unless they be taught first of all, that God is the Father and Lord of all things, and sees all things, and that thence he bestows a happy life upon those that follow him, but plunges such as do not walk in the paths of virtue into inevitable miseries. Now when Moses was desirous to teach this lesson to his countrymen, he did not begin the establishment of his laws after the same manner that other legislators did, upon contracts and other rights between one man and another, but by raising their minds upwards to regard God, and his creation of the world, and by persuading them, that we men are the most excellent of the creatures of God upon earth. Now when once he had brought them to submit to religion, he easily persuaded them to submit in all other things, for as to other legislators, they followed fables, and by their discourse, transferred the most reproachful of human vices unto the gods, and afforded wicked men the most plausible excuses for their crimes. But as for our legislator, when he had once demonstrated that God was possessed of perfect virtue, he supposed that men also ought to strive after the participation of it, and on those who did not so think, and so believe, he inflicted the severest punishments. I exhort, therefore, my readers to examine this whole undertaking in that view, for thereby it will appear to them, that there is nothing therein disagreeable either to the majesty of God, or to his love to mankind, for all things have here a reference to the nature of the universe, while our legislator speaks some things wisely, but enigmatically, and others under a decent allegory, but still explains such things as required a direct explication, plainly and expressly. However, those that have a mind to know the reasons of everything may find here a very curious philosophical theory, which I now indeed shall waive the explication of, but if God afford me time for it, I will set about writing it 6, after I have finished the present work. I shall now betake myself to the history before me, after I have first mentioned what Moses says of the creation of the world, which I find described in the sacred books after the manner following. Book I, containing the interval of 3,833 years. From the creation to the death of Isaac. Chapter 1. The constitution of the world and the disposition of the element. 1. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But when the earth did not come into sight, but was covered with thick darkness, and a wind moved upon its surface, God commanded that there should be light, and when that was made, he considered the whole mass, and separated the light and the darkness, and the name he gave to one was night, and the other he called day, and he named the beginning of light, and the time of rest, the evening and the morning, and this was indeed the first day. But Moses said it was one day, the cause of which I am able to give even now, but because I have promised to give such reasons for all things in a treatise by itself, I shall put off its exposition till that time. After this, on the second day, he placed the heaven over the whole world, and separated it from the other parts, and he determined it should stand by itself. He also placed a crystalline firmament round it, and put it together in a manner agreeable to the earth, and fitted it for giving moisture and rain, and for affording the advantage of dews. On the third day he appointed the dry land to appear, with the sea itself around about it, and on the very same day he made the plants and the seeds, to spring out of the earth. On the fourth day he adorned the heaven with the sun, the moon, and the other stars, and appointed them their motions and courses, that the vicissitudes of the seasons might be clearly signified. And on the fifth day he produced the living creatures, both those that swim, and those that fly, the former in the sea, the latter in the air. He also sorted them as to society and mixture, for procreation, and that their kinds might increase and multiply. On the sixth day he created the four-footed beasts, and made them male and female. On the same day he also formed man. Accordingly Moses says, that in just 6 days the world, and all that is therein, was made. And that the seventh day was a rest, and a release from the labor of such operations, whence it is, that we celebrate a rest from our labors on that day, and call it the Sabbath, which word denotes rest in the Hebrew tongue. 2. Moreover, Moses, after the seventh day was over, begins to talk philosophically, and concerning the formation of men, says thus, that God took dust from the ground, and formed man, and inserted in him a spirit and a soul. So this man was called Adam, which in the Hebrew tongue, signifies one that is red, because he was formed out of red earth, compounded together, for of that kind is virgin and true earth. God also presented the living creatures, when he had made them, according to their kinds, both male and female, to Adam, who gave them those names by which they are still called. But when he saw that Adam had no female companion, no society, for there was no such created, and that he wondered at the other animals which were male and female, he laid him asleep, and took away one of his ribs, and out of it formed a woman, whereupon Adam knew her, when she was brought to him, and acknowledged that she was made out of himself. Now a woman is called in the Hebrew tongue Isa, but the name of this woman was Eve, which signifies the mother of all living. 3. Moses says further, that God planted a paradise in the east, flourishing with all sorts of trees, and that among them was the tree of life, and another of knowledge, whereby was to be known what was good and evil, and that when he brought Adam and his wife into this garden, he commanded him to take care of the plants. Now the garden was watered by one river, 3 which ran round about the whole earth, and was parted into 4 parts. And Pison, which denotes a multitude, running into India, makes its exit into the sea, and is by the Greeks called Ganges. Euphrates also, as well as Tigris, goes down into the Red Sea. For now the name Euphrates, or Phrath, denotes either a dispersion, or a flower by Tiris, or Diglath, is signified what is swift, with narrowness, and Gian runs through Egypt, and denotes what arises from the east, which the Greeks call Nile. 4. God therefore commanded, that Adam and his wife should eat of all the rest of the plants, but to abstain from the tree of knowledge, and foretold to them, that if they touched it, it would prove their destruction. But while all the living creatures had one language, 5 at that time the serpent, which then lived together with Adam and his wife, showed an envious disposition, at his supposal of their living happily, and in obedience to the commands of God, and imagining, that when they disobeyed them, they would fall into calamities, he persuaded the woman, out of a malicious intention, to taste of the tree of knowledge, telling them, that in that tree, was the knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge, when they should obtain, they would lead a happy life, nay, a life not inferior to that of a god, by which means he overcame the woman, and persuaded her to despise the command of God. Now when she had tasted of that tree, and was pleased with its fruit, she persuaded Adam to make use of it also. Upon this they perceived, that they would become naked to one another, and being ashamed thus to appear abroad, they invented somewhat to cover them, for the tree sharpened their understanding, and they covered themselves with fig leaves, and tying these before them, out of modesty, they thought they were happier than they were before, as they had discovered what they were in want of. But when God came into the garden, Adam, who was wont before to come and converse with him, being conscious of his wicked behavior, went out of the way. This behavior surprised God, and he asked what was the cause of this his procedure, and why he, that before delighted in that conversation, did now fly from it, and avoid it. When he made no reply, as conscious to himself, that he had transgressed the command of God, God said, I had before determined about you both, how you might lead a happy life, without any affliction, and care, and vexation of soul, and that all things which might contribute to your enjoyment and pleasure should grow up by my providence, of their own accord, without your own labor and painstaking, which state of labor and painstaking would soon bring on old age, and death would not be at any remote distance. But now thou hast abused this my goodwill, and hast disobeyed my commands, for thy silence is not the sign of thy virtue, but of thy evil conscience. However, Adam excused his sin, and entreated God not to be angry at him, and laid the blame of what was done upon his wife, and said that he was deceived by her, and thence became an offender, while she again accused the serpent. But God allotted him punishment, because he weakly submitted to the counsel of his wife, and said the ground should not henceforth yield its fruits of its own accord, but that when it should be harassed by their labor, it should bring forth some of its fruits, and refuse to bring forth others. He also made Eve liable to the inconveniency of breeding, and the sharp pains of bringing forth children, and this because she persuaded Adam with the same arguments wherewith the serpent had persuaded her, and had thereby brought him into a calamitous condition. He also deprived the serpent of speech, out of indignation at his malicious disposition towards Adam. Besides this, he inserted poison under his tongue, and made him an enemy to men, and suggested to them, that they should direct their strokes against his head, that being the place wherein lay his mischievous designs towards men, and it being easiest to take vengeance on him, that way. And when he had deprived him of the use of his feet, he made him to go rolling all along, and dragging himself upon the ground. And when God had appointed these penalties for them, he removed Adam and Eve out of the garden into another place. Chapter 2. Concerning the posterity of Adam, and the 10 generations from him to the deluge. 1. Adam and Eve had 2 sons. The elder of them was named Cain, which name, when it is interpreted, signifies a possession. The younger was Abel, which signifies sorrow. They had also daughters. Now the 2 brethren were pleased with different courses of life. For Abel, the younger, was a lover of righteousness, and believing that God was present at all his actions, he excelled in virtue, and his employment was that of a shepherd. But Cain was not only very wicked in other respects, but was wholly intent upon getting, and he first contrived to plough the ground. He slew his brother on the occasion following. They had resolved to sacrifice to God. Now Cain brought the fruits of the earth, and of his husbandry. But Abel brought milk, and the firstfruits of his flocks. But God was more delighted with a latter oblation, 6 when he was honoured with what grew naturally of its own accord, than he was with what was the invention of a covetous man, and gotten by forcing the ground, whence it was, that Cain was very angry, that Abel was preferred by God before him, and he slew his brother, and hid his dead body. thinking to escape discovery. But God, knowing what had been done, came to Cain, and asked him what was become of his brother, because he had not seen him of many days, whereas he used to observe them conversing together at other times. But Cain was in doubt with himself, and knew not what answer to give to God. At first he said that he was himself at a loss about his brother's disappearing, but when he was provoked by God, who pressed him vehemently, as resolving to know what the matter was, he replied, he was not his brother's guardian or keeper, nor was he an observer of what he did. But, in return, God convicted Cain, as having been the murderer of his brother, and said, I wonder at thee, that thou knowest not what is become of a man whom thou thyself hast destroyed. God therefore did not inflict the punishment of death upon him, on account of his offering sacrifice, and thereby making supplication to him not to be extreme in his wrath to him, but he made him accursed, and threatened his posterity in the 7th generation. He also cast him, together with his wife, out of that land. And when he was afraid that, in wandering about he should fall among wild beasts, and by that means perish, God bid him not to entertain such a melancholy suspicion, and to go over all the earth without fear, of what mischief he might suffer from wild beasts, and setting a mark upon him, that he might be known, he commanded him to depart. 2. And when Cain had travelled over many countries, he, with his wife, built a city, named Nod, which is a place so called, and there he settled his abode, where also he had children. However, he did not accept of his punishment in order to amendment, but to increase his wickedness, for he only aimed to procure everything that was for his own bodily pleasure, though it obliged him to be injurious to his neighbours. He augmented his household substance with much wealth, by rapine and violence. He excited his acquaintance, to procure pleasures and spoils by robbery, and became a great leader of men into wicked courses. He also introduced the change in that way of simplicity wherein men lived before, and was the author of measures and weights. And whereas they lived innocently and generously, while they knew nothing of such arts, he changed the world into cunning craftiness. He first of all set boundaries about lands. He built a city, and fortified it with walls, and he compelled his family to come together to it, and called it city Enoch, after the name of his eldest son Enoch. Now Jared was the son of Enoch, whose son was Malaleel, whose son was Methuselah, whose son was Lamech, who had 77 children by 2 wives, Zillah and Adah. Of those children by Adah, one was Jabal. He erected tents, and loved the life of a shepherd. But Jubal, who was born of the same mother with him, exercised himself in music. 7 and invented the psaltery and the harp. But Jubal, one of his children by the other wife, exceeded all men in strength, and was very expert and famous in martial performances. He procured what tended to the pleasures of the body by that method, and first of all invented the art of making brass. Lamech was also the father of a daughter, whose name was Naamah. And because he was so skillful in matters of divine revelation, that he knew he was to be punished for Cain's murder of his brother, he made that known to his wives. Nay, even while Adam was alive, it came to pass, that the posterity of Cain became exceeding wicked, every one successively dying, one after another, more wicked than the former. They were intolerable in war, and vehement in robberies, and if anyone was slow to murder people, yet was he bold in his profligate behavior, in acting unjustly, and doing injuries for gain. 3. Now Adam, who was the first man, and made out of the earth, for our discourse must now be about him, after Abel was slain, and Cain fled away, on account of his murder, was solicitous for posterity, and had a vehement desire of children, he being 230 years old, after which time he lived other 700, and then died. He had indeed many other children, 8 but Seth in particular. As for the rest, it would be tedious to name them. I will therefore only endeavor to give an account of those that proceeded from Seth. Now this Seth, when he was brought up, and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man, and as he was himself of an excellent character, so did he leave children behind him who imitated his virtues. 9 All these proved to be of good dispositions. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions, and in a happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them, till they died. They also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies, and their order. and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known. Upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and at another time by the violence and quantity of water, they made 2 pillars, 10, the one of brick, the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both, that in case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain, and exhibit those discoveries to mankind, and also inform them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. Now this remains in the land of Syria to this day. Chapter 3. Concerning the flood, and after what manner Noah was saved in an ark, with his kindred, and afterwards dwelt in the plain of Shinar. 1. Now this posterity of Seth continued to esteem God as the Lord of the universe, and to have an entire regard to virtue, for 7 generations, but in process of time they were perverted, and forsook the practices of their forefathers, and did neither pay those honors to God, which were appointed them, nor had they any concern to do justice towards men. But for what degree of zeal they had formerly shown for virtue, they now showed by their actions a double degree of wickedness, whereby they made God to be their enemy. For many angels 11 of God accompanied with women, and begat sons that proved unjust, and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence they had in their own strength. For the tradition is, that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants. But Noah was very uneasy at what they did, and being displeased at their conduct, persuaded them to change their dispositions and their acts for the better. But seeing they did not yield to him, but were slaves to their wicked pleasures, he was afraid they would kill him, together with his wife and children, and those they had married, so he departed out of that land. 2. Now God loved this man for his righteousness, yet he not only condemned those other men for their wickedness, but determined to destroy the whole race of mankind, and to make another race, that should be pure from wickedness, and cutting short their lives, and making their years not so many as they formerly lived, but 120 only. 12. He turned the dry land into sea, and thus were all these men destroyed. But Noah alone was saved, for God suggested to him the following contrivance and way of escape, that he should make an ark of 4 stories high, 300 cubits 13 long, 50 cubits broad, and 30 cubits high. Accordingly he entered into that ark, and his wife, and sons, and their wives, and put into it not only other provisions, to support their wants there, but also sent in with the rest all sorts of living creatures, the male and his female, for the preservation of their kinds, and others of them by 7s. Now this ark had firm walls, and a roof, and was braced with cross beams, so that it could not be any way drowned, or overborne by the violence of the water. And thus was Noah, with his family, preserved. Now he was the 10th from Adam, as being the son of Lamech, whose father was Methuselah. He was the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, and Jared was the son of Malaleel, who, with many of his sisters, were the children of Canaan, the son of Enos. Now Enos was the son of Seth, the son of Adam. 3. This calamity happened in the 600th year of Noah's government, age, in the 2nd month, 14, called by the Macedonians Dies, but by the Hebrews Marchesuan, for so did they order their year in Egypt. But Moses appointed that Toinesan, which is the same with Xanthicus, should be the 1st month for their festivals, because he brought them out of Egypt in that month, so that this month began the year as to all the solemnities they observed to the honor of God, although he preserved the original order of the months as to selling and buying, and other ordinary affairs. Now he says, that this flood began on the 27th 17th day of the forementioned month, and this was 1656 years from Adam, the first man, and the time is written down in our sacred books, those who then lived having noted down, 15, with great accuracy, both the births and deaths of illustrious men. 4. For indeed Seth was born, when Adam was in his 230th year, who lived 930 years. Seth begat Enos in his 205th year, who, when he had lived 912 years, delivered the government to Canaan his son, whom he had in his 190th year. He lived 905 years. Canaan, when he had lived 910 years, had his son Malaleel, who was born in his 170th year. This Malaleel, having lived 895 years, died, leaving his son Jared, whom he begat, when he was in his 165th year. He lived 962 years, and then his son Enoch succeeded him, who was born when his father was 162 years old. Now he, when he had lived 365 years, departed and went to God, whence it is, that they have not written down his death. Now Methuselah, the son of Enoch, who was born to him, when he was 165 years old, had Lamech for his son, when he was 187 years of age, to whom he delivered the government, when he had retained it 969 years. Now Lamech, when he had governed 777 years, appointed Noah, his son, to be ruler of the people, who was born to Lamech, when he was 182 years old, and retained the government 950 years. These years collected together make up the sum before set down. But let no one inquire into the deaths of these men, for they extended their lives along together with their children and grandchildren, but let him have regard to their births only. 5. When God gave the signal, and it began to rain, the water poured down 40 entire days, till it became 15 cubits higher than the earth, which was the reason why there was no greater number preserved, since they had no place to fly to. When the rain ceased, the water did but just begin to abate after 150 days, that is, on the 17th day of the 7th month, it then ceasing to subside for a little while. After this, the ark rested on the top of a certain mountain in Armenia, which, when Noah understood, he opened it, and seeing a small piece of land about it, he continued quiet, and conceived some cheerful hopes of deliverance. But a few days afterward, when the water was decreased to a greater degree, he sent out a raven, as desirous to learn whether any other part of the earth were left dry by the water, and whether he might go out of the ark with safety. But the raven, finding all the land still overflowed, returned to Noah again. And after 7 days he sent out a dove, to know the state of the ground, which came back to him covered with mud, and bringing an olive branch, hereby Noah learned that the earth was become clear of the flood. So after he had stayed 7 more days, he sent the living creatures out of the ark, and both he and his family went out, when he also sacrificed to God, and feasted with his companions. However, the Armenians call this place, Greek 16, the place of descent, for the ark being saved in that place, its remains are shown there by the inhabitants to this day. 6. Now all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood, and of this ark, among whom is Berosus the Chaldean. For when he is describing the circumstances of the flood, he goes on thus: it is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Chaldeans, and that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away, and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. Hieronymus the Egyptian also, who wrote the Phoenician Antiquities, and Nassis, and a great many more, make mention of the same. Nay, Nicolaus of Damascus, in his 96th book, hath a particular relation about them, where he speaks thus: there is a great mountain in Armenia, over Minas, called Baris, upon which it is reported, that many who fled at the time of the deluge were saved, and that one who was carried in an ark came on shore upon the top of it, and that the remains of the timber were a great while preserved. This might be the man about whom Moses the legislator of the Jews wrote. 7. But as for Noah, he was afraid, since God had determined to destroy mankind, lest he should drown the earth every year, so he offered burnt offerings, and besought God, that nature might hereafter go on in its former orderly course, and that he would not bring on so great a judgment any more, by which the whole race of creatures might be in danger of destruction, but that, having now punished the wicked, he would of his goodness spare the remainder, and such as he had hitherto judged fit to be delivered from so severe a calamity, for that otherwise these last must be more miserable than the first, and that they must be condemned to a worse condition than the others, unless they be suffered to escape entirely, that is, if they be reserved for another deluge, while they must be afflicted with the terror and sight of the first deluge, and must also be destroyed by a second. He also entreated God to accept of his sacrifice, and to grant that the earth might never again undergo the like effects of his wrath, that men might be permitted to go on cheerfully in cultivating the same, to build cities, and live happily in them, and that they might not be deprived of any of those good things which they enjoyed before the flood, but might attain to the like length of days, and old age, which the ancient people had arrived at before. 8. When Noah had made these supplications, God, who loved the man for his righteousness, granted entire success to his prayers, and said, that it was not he who brought the destruction on a polluted world, but that they underwent that vengeance on account of their own wickedness. and that he had not brought men into the world, if he had himself determined to destroy them, it being an instance of greater wisdom not to have granted them life at all, than, after it was granted, to procure their destruction. But the injuries, said he, they offered to my holiness and virtue, forced me to bring this punishment upon them. But I will leave off for the time to come to require such punishments, the effects of so great wrath, for their future wicked actions, and especially on account of thy prayers. But if I shall at any time send tempests of rain, in an extraordinary manner, be not affrighted at the largeness of the showers, for the water shall no more overspread the earth. However, I require you to abstain from shedding the blood of men, and to keep yourselves pure from murder, and to punish those that commit any such thing. I permit you to make use of all the other living creatures at your pleasure, and as your appetites lead you, for I have made you lords of them all, both of those that walk on the land, and those that swim in the waters, and of those that fly in the regions of the air on high, excepting their blood, for therein is the life. But I will give you a sign, that I have left off my anger by my bow, whereby is meant the rainbow, for they determined that the rainbow was the bow of God. And when God had said and promised this, he went away. 9. Now when Noah had lived 350 years after the flood, and that all that time happily, he died, having lived the number of 950 years. But let no one, upon comparing the lives of the ancients with our lives, and with the few years which we now live, think that what we have said of them is false, or make the shortness of our lives at present an argument, that neither did they attain to so long a duration of life, for those ancients were beloved of God, and lately made by God himself, and because their food was then fitter for the prolongation of life, might well live so great a number of years, and besides, God afforded them a longer time of life on account of their virtue, and the good use they made of it in astronomical and geometrical discoveries, which would not have afforded the time of foretelling the periods of the stars, unless they had lived 600 years, for the great year is completed in that interval. Now I have for witnesses to what I have said, all those that have written antiquities, both among the Greeks and barbarians, for even Manetho, who wrote the Egyptian history, and Berosus, who collected the Chaldean monuments, and Mochus, and Histiaeus, and, besides these, Hieronymus the Egyptian, and those who composed the Phoenician history, agree to what I hear say Hesiod also, and Hicatius, Hellanicus, and Acusilaus, and besides these, Ephorus and Nicolaus relate, that the ancients lived 1,000 years. But as to these matters, let every one look upon them as he thinks fit. Chapter 4. Concerning the Tower of Babylon, and the confusion of tongues. 1. Now the sons of Noah were 3, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, born 100 years before the deluge. These first of all descended from the mountains into the plains, and fixed their habitation there, and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very loath to come down from the higher places, to venture to follow their examples. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad, for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth, and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were so ill instructed, that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities, and were made sensible, by experience, of what sin they had been guilty for. When they flourished with a numerous youth, God admonished them again to send out colonies, but they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed, was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful condition they were in, did not obey him. Nay, they added to this their disobedience to the divine will, the suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that, being divided asunder, they might the more easily be oppressed. 2. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured their happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God, if he should have a mind, to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters, to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. 3. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God, and they built a tower, neither sparing any pains, nor being in any degree negligent about the work, and, by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect, but the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed, upon the view, to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar, made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners, but he caused a tumult among them, by producing in them divers languages, and causing that, through the multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower, and of the confusion of the language, when she says thus: when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they would thereby ascend up to heaven, but the gods sent storms of wind, and overthrew the tower, and gave every one his peculiar language, and for this reason it was, that the city was called Babylon. But as to the plan of Shinar, in the country of Babylonia, Hesychius mentions it, when he says thus: such of the priests as were saved, took the sacred vessels of Jupiter and Ialius, and came to Shinar of Babylonia. Chapter 5. After what manner the posterity of Noah sent out colonies, and inhabited the whole earth. 1. After this they were dispersed abroad, on account of their languages, and went out by colonies everywhere, and each colony took possession of that land which they light upon, and unto which God led them, so that the whole continent was filled with them, both the inland and the maritime countries. There were some also who passed over the sea in ships, and inhabited the islands, and some of those nations do still retain the denominations which were given them by their first founders, but some have lost them also, and some have only admitted certain changes in them, that they might be the more intelligible to the inhabitants. And they were the Greeks who became the authors of such mutations. For when in after ages they grew potent, they claimed to themselves the glory of antiquity, giving names to the nations, that sounded well in Greek, that they might be better understood among themselves, and setting agreeable forms of government over them, as if they were a people derived from themselves. Chapter 6. How every nation was denominated from their first inhabitants. 1. Now they were the grandchildren of Noah, in honor of whom names were imposed on the nations by those that first seized upon them. Japhet, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. They inhabited so, that, beginning at the mountains Taurus and Amanus, they proceeded along Asia, as far as the river Tansis, and along Europe to Cadiz, and settling themselves on the lands, which they light upon, which none had inhabited before, they called the nations by their own names. For Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galatians, Gauls, but were then called Gomerites. Magog founded those that from him were named Magagites, but who were by the Greeks called Scythians. Now as to Javan and Madai, the sons of Japhet, from Madai came the Medians, who were called Medes, by the Greeks, but from Javan, Ionia, and all the Grecians, are derived. Phobal founded the Phobalites, who are now called Iberes, and the Mosachini were founded by Mosoch, now they are Cappadocians. There is also a mark of their ancient denomination still to be shown, for there is even now among them a city called Mazacah, which may inform those that are able to understand, that so was the entire nation once called. Thyris also called those whom he ruled over Thracians, but the Greeks changed the name into Thracians. And so many were the countries that had the children of Japhet for their inhabitants. Of the 3 sons of Gomer, Asynax founded the Asynaxians, who are now called by the Greeks Rhyginians. So did Riphath found the Riphians, now called Paphlagonians, and Thragrama the Thragramians, who, as the Greeks resolved, were named Phrygians. Of the 3 sons of Javan also, the son of Japhet, Elisa gave name to the Elysians, who were his subjects. They are now the Aeolians. Tharsis to the Thasians, for so was Cilicia of old called, the sign of which is this, that the noblest city they have, and a metropolis also, is Tarsus, the Tau being by change, put for the theta. Sephimus possessed the island Sephima, it is now called Cyprus. and from that it is the tall islands, and the greatest part of the sea-coasts, are named Sephim by the Hebrews, and one city there is in Cyprus, that has been able to preserve its denomination. It has been called Citius by those who use the language of the Greeks, and has not, by the use of that dialect, escaped the name of Sephim. And so many nations have the children and grandchildren of Japhet possessed. Now when I have premised somewhat, which perhaps the Greeks do not know, I will return, and explain what I have omitted, for such names are pronounced here after the manner of the Greeks, to please my readers, for our own country language does not so pronounce them, but the names in all cases, are of one and the same ending, for the name we here pronounce Noas, is there Noah, and in every case, retains the same termination. 2. The children of Ham possessed the land from Syria and Amanus, and the mountains of Libanus, seizing upon all that was on its sea-coasts, and as far as the ocean, and keeping it as their own. Some indeed of its names are utterly vanished away, others of them being changed, and another sound given them, are hardly to be discovered, yet a few there are which have kept their denominations entire. 4 of the 4 sons of Ham, time has not at all hurt the name of Chus, for the Ethiopians, over whom he reigned, are even at this day, both by themselves, and by all men in Asia, called Jews.Pt1. The memory also of the Mesronites is preserved in their name, for all we who inhabit this country of Judea called Egypt Mester, and the Egyptians Mystrians. Phite also was the founder of Libya, and called the inhabitants Phutites. From himself there is also a river in the country of Moors which bears that name, whence it is, that we may see the greatest part of the Grecian historiographers mention, that river and the adjoining country by the appellation of Phut, but the name it has now has been by change given it from one of the sons of Mesraim, who was called Libius. We will inform you presently what has been the occasion, why it has been called Africa also. Canaan, the 4th son of Ham, inhabited the country now called Judea, and called it from his own name Canaan. The children of these 4 were these Sabas, who founded the Sabaeans, Evilus, who founded the Avilians, who were called Jachuli, Sabbats founded the Sabbathans, they are now called by the Greeks Astabolans, Sabactus settled the Sabactans, and Ragmus the Ragmians, and he had 2 sons, the one of whom, Judadus, settled the Judadeans, a nation of the western Ethiopians, and left them his name, as did Sabas to the Sabaeans but Nimrod, the son of Chus, stayed and tyrannized at Babylon, as we have already informed you. Now all the children of Mesraim, being 8 in number, possessed the country from Gaza to Egypt, though it retained the name of one only, the Philistim, for the Greeks call part of that country Palestine. As for the rest, Ludim, and Enamim, and Labim, who alone inhabited in Libya, and called the country from himself, Nedim, and Phethrasim, and Chesloim, and Siphorim, we know nothing of them besides their names, for the Ethiopic War 17 which we shall describe hereafter, was the cause, that those cities were overthrown. The sons of Canaan were these Sidonius, who also built a city of the same name. It is called by the Greeks Sidonamathus, inhabited in Amathene, which is even now called Damad by the inhabitants, although the Macedonians named it Epiphania. From one of his posterity Erudius possessed the island, Eridus Eurycus possessed Ars, which is in Libanus. But for the 7 others, Eueus, Chedius, Jebusius, Amorius, Gergesus, Eudius, Cineus, Samarius, we have nothing in the sacred books but their names, for the Hebrews overthrew their cities, and their calamities came upon them on the occasion following. 3. Noah, when, after the deluge, the earth was resettled in its former condition, set about its cultivation, and when he had planted it with vines, and when the fruit was ripe, and he had gathered the grapes in their season, and the wine was ready for use, he offered sacrifice, and feasted, and, being drunk, he fell asleep, and lay naked in an unseemly manner. When his youngest son saw this, he came laughing, and showed him to his brethren, but they covered their father's nakedness. And when Noah was made sensible of what had been done, he prayed for prosperity to his other sons, but for Ham, he did not curse him, by reason of his nearness in blood, but cursed his prosperity, and when the rest of them escaped that curse, God inflicted it on the children of Canaan. But as to these matters, we shall speak more hereafter. 4. Shem, the 3rd son of Noah, had 5 sons, who inhabited the land, that began at Euphrates, and reached to the Indian Ocean. For Elam left behind him the Elamites, the ancestors of the Persians. Asher lived at the city Nineveh, and named his subjects Assyrians, who became the most fortunate nation, beyond others. Arphaxad named the Arphaxidites, who are now called Chaldeans. Aram had the Aramites, which the Greeks called Syrians, as Lord founded the Lordites, which are now called Lydians. Of the 4 sons of Aram, Uz founded Trachonitis and Damascus. This country lies between Palestine and Celesyria. Ul founded Armenia, and Gada the Bactrians, and Mesa the Messanians. It is now called Cherax-Spasini. Salah was the son of Arphaxad, and his son was Heber, from whom they originally called the Jews Hebrews. 18 Heber begat Jotam and Phaleg. He was called Phaleg, because he was born at the dispersion of the nations to their several countries, for Phaleg among the Hebrews signifies division. Now Jotam, one of the sons of Heber, had these sons: Elmadad, Salaph, Asermith, Jerah, Adoram, Azel, Decla, Ebal, Abimael, Sabius, Ophir, Uelit, and Jobab. These inhabited from Kophen, an Indian river, and in part of Asia adjoining to it. And this shall suffice concerning the sons of Shem. 5. I will now treat of the Hebrews. The son of Phaleg, whose father was Heber, was Ragor, whose son was Serug, to whom was born Nahor. His son was Terah, who was the father of Abraham, who accordingly was the 10th from Noah, and was born in the 292nd year after the deluge, for Terah begat Abram in his 70th year. Nahor begat Haran, when he was 120 years old. Nahor was born to Serug in his 132nd year. Ragor had Serug at 130. At the same age also Phaleg had Ragor. Heber begat Phaleg in his 134th year, he himself being begotten by Salah, when he was 130 years old, whom Arphaxad had for his son at the 135th year of his age. Arphaxad was the son of Shem, and born 12 years after the deluge. Now Abram had 2 brethren, Nahor and Haran. Of these Haran left a son, Lot, as also Sarai and Milcah his daughters, and died among the Chaldeans, in a city of the Chaldeans, called Ur, and his monument is shown to this day. These married their nieces. Nabal married Milcah, and Abram married Sarai. Now Terah, hating Chaldea, on account of his mourning for Iran, they all removed to Haran of Mesopotamia, where Terah died, and was buried, when he had lived to be 205 years old, for the life of man was already, by degrees, diminished, and became shorter than before, till the birth of Moses, after whom the term of human life was 120 years, God determining it to the length that Moses happened to live. Now Nahor had 8 sons by Milcah, Uz and Buz, Kemuel, Chist, Azor, Feldus, Jadalf, and Bethuel. These were all the genuine sons of Nahor, for Teba, and Gam, and Tachus, and Maacah, were born of Reumah his concubine, but Bethuel had a daughter, Rebekah, and a son, Laban. Chapter 7. How Abram our forefather went out of the land of the Chaldeans, and lived in the land then called Canaan but now Judea. 1. Now Abram, having no son of his own, adopted Lot, his brother Haran's son, and his wife Sarai's brother, and he left the land of Chaldea, when he was 75 years old, and at the command of God went into Canaan, and therein he dwelt himself, and left it to his posterity. He was a person of great sagacity, both for understanding all things, and persuading his hearers, and not mistaken in his opinions, for which reason he began to have high notions of virtue than others had, and he determined to renew, and to change the opinion all men happened then to have concerning God, for he was the first that ventured to publish this notion, that there was but one God, the creator of the universe, and that, as to other gods, if they contributed anything to the happiness of men, that each of them afforded it only according to his appointment, and not by their own power. This his opinion was derived from the irregular phenomena, that were visible both at land and sea, as well as those that happened to the sun, and moon, and all the heavenly bodies. Thus, if said he these bodies had power of their own, they would certainly take care of their own regular motions, but since they do not preserve such regularity, they make it plain, that in so far as they cooperate to our advantage, they do it not of their own abilities, but as they are subservient to him that commands them, to whom alone we ought justly to offer our honor and thanksgiving. For which doctrines, when the Chaldeans, and other people of Mesopotamia, raised a tumult against him, he thought fit to leave that country, and at the command, and by the assistance of God, he came and lived in the land of Canaan. And when he was there settled, he built an altar, and performed a sacrifice to God. 2. Berosus mentions our father Abram without naming him, when he says thus: in the 10th generation after the flood, there was among the Chaldeans a man righteous and great, and skillful in the celestial science. But Hicatius does more than barely mention him, for he composed, and left behind him, a book concerning him. And Nicolaus of Damascus, in the 4th book of his history, says thus: Abram reigned at Damascus, being a foreigner, who came with an army out of the land above Babylon, called the land of the Chaldeans. But, after a long time, he got him up, and removed from that country also, with his people, and went into the land then called the land of Canaan, but now the land of Judea, and this when his posterity will become a multitude. As to which posterity of his, we relate their history in another work. Now the name of Abram is even still famous in the country of Damascus, and there is shown a village named from him, the habitation of Abram. Chapter 8. That when there was a famine in Canaan, Abram went thence into Egypt, and after he had continued there while he returned back again. 1. Now, after this, when a famine had invaded the land of Canaan, and Abram had discovered that the Egyptians were in a flourishing condition, he was disposed to go down to them, both to partake of the plenty they enjoyed, and to become an auditor of their priests, and to know what they said concerning the gods, designing either to follow them, if they had better notions than he, or to convert them into a better way, if his own notions proved the truest. Now, seeing he was to take Sarai with him, and was afraid of the madness of the Egyptians with regard to women, lest the king should kill him on occasion of his wife's great beauty, he contrived this device: he pretended to be her brother, and directed her in a dissembling way to pretend the same, for he said it would be for their benefit. Now, as soon as he came into Egypt, it happened to Abram as he supposed it would, for the fame of his wife's beauty was greatly talked of, for which reason Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, would not be satisfied with what was reported of her, but would needs see her himself, and was preparing to enjoy her. But God put a stop to his unjust inclinations, by sending upon him a distemper, and a sedition against his government. And when he inquired of the priests how he might be freed from these calamities, they told him that this his miserable condition was derived from the wrath of God, upon account of his inclinations to abuse the stranger's wife. He then, out of fear, asked Sarai who she was, and who it was that she brought along with her. And when he had found out the truth,